So last week we had talked about there's in the Declaration of Independence, in the very beginning, it sets forth 6 principles total. The first 2 we went over last week. The first one is in the Declaration of Independence. Let me see if I can show you my screen. I did try to work on that, and it is not working again. We'll have that fixed next week. So in the beginning of the Declaration of Independence, it says, pull it back up here. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator, big C, with certain inalienable rights. Okay, so that's principle 1, that there is a God and he is above government, and this is the first step in limiting government. And that's, of course, why it's number 1 on the list. It's the first step in limiting government. In Judges, you can look this up on your own because I don't have screen share right now. Judges chapter 8, 22 through 23, Israel asks for a king. Gideon says no. Gideon, if you remember, he was a farmer, essentially, and God told him, I'm going to free your country from the Midianites using you, and he didn't, he was kind of questioning himself, didn't know what to do, and he finally went through with it, and eventually Israel said, hey, Gideon, you did such a great job, we want to make you king. And Gideon says, no, God will rule over you. And interestingly enough, George Washington said the same thing after we won the war, almost verbatim. So in the original, the first principle, it directly states that there is a God, he is above government, and that he is the one that governs over us. If God directly governs man, any entity that tries to step between that is violating a sacred jurisdiction, as we discussed last week also, whether you asked for it or not. And that was a big thing with the colonists at the time in 1776. Only 20% of the colonists wanted to do this thing. The founding fathers were in the minority, which should encourage you. Right now in our country, it might feel like that the people who actually love this country and want to see it progress, that might feel like a minority sometimes. But that's all we need. A minority is all it takes to change the world. American minorities have changed the world many times, and there's no reason why it can't be done again. But going back to the original principle, if God directly governs man, if God directly governs you, individual, family, whatever, husband, whatever, if God directly governs you, and anybody steps between there, whether you ask them to or not, that is violating a sacred jurisdiction that God himself set into place. It's just like marriage. Let no man put asunder what God hath joined together. The same principle is being violated whenever you put a king, or whenever any of our leaders in Washington, as soon as you start calling them leaders, like I just did, you're violating that sacred separation. They're not leaders. They're paid employees that do what we tell them, or at least they should. The second principle we discussed was that rights do not come from government, they come from God. It says again, they are endowed by their creator, again, big C, with certain unalienable rights. Okay? Rights do not come from government, they come from God. And again, that's the second principle that we discussed last time. The second principle is that rights do not come from God. Rights predate government. Your human rights, your civil liberties predate government, all government, whether Babylon, whether it's ours, whether it's Great Britain, where we came from, any government on earth, your human rights and your civil liberties predate any government. Genesis chapter 6 and 11 through 12, God says that the earth was filled with violence and all the flesh had corrupted it. This is what prompted God to completely destroy the world with the flood, the story of Noah. I think most people know that story. The fact that the earth was filled with violence and all flesh had corrupted it, that was what prompted God, what tempted God to destroy the world to begin with. In order to prevent that from happening again, God gave Noah a secular law, the first secular law given for a man to govern over. Now, that wasn't the case with Adam and Eve. God directly governed over them. After the world was completely violent and crazy things were happening, God washed the world in water, destroyed everything and started over. And the first thing he did after he started over was set up a new government system where he gives laws to man for them to govern. Okay? God gives those laws. God gives those rights. What was the first law that he gave to Noah? Interestingly enough, in the Declaration of Independence, it says that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these, meaning there's many, many rights, but among these, we're going to give you three. There's life, there's liberty, and there's the pursuit of happiness. Originally, it was property, and of course, we all know the reasons for that, and we'll get into that later. But the first principle, the first right that you have that's sacred is life. The first law given by God to Noah was to protect your life. It was, thou shalt not commit murder. It didn't say it quite that way, but essentially, he who sheds blood, innocent blood, shall be put to death. That was a check on a human being violating your right to life. That is a protection you have against any human being, whether it's government or not, whether it's your neighbor, which is what they discuss a lot in the founding documents, but your neighbor went to Washington back then. Mr. Smith goes to Washington. That's exactly what happened. George Washington was a farmer, okay, just a neighbor. So whenever it talks about neighbor, the people in Washington are your neighbors, okay? Matt Gaetz, I've met him a few times. He's one of my representatives here in Florida. He's a neighbor. He's from here, okay? He's a neighbor. So again, Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, God gave the first law to govern man, and he gave it to Noah, and the first law was to protect your right to life. We'll go over that here in the next few sessions about why they listed it life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, or life, liberty, property, however you want to look at it. The reason why those are listed that way. There's a reason why life is first. There's a reason why liberty is second. And there's a reason why pursuit of happiness and property were further down the list. There's a huge reason why life was first, okay? They deliberated in the Constitution over commas for weeks. Commas, just a comma. They deliberated for weeks. Why wouldn't they deliberate over the position of where these words go into place in the Declaration before sending it to the king and telling him where to stick it? Okay, they absolutely put it there for a reason, and I'll show you that in a later video. But this week, we're going to go over the third principle that is in the Declaration of Independence. Governments are instituted among men to preserve these rights. That's in the Declaration of Independence. Look it up. It's in the first few sentences. We begin to see this concept start to take shape with Noah's first law. Governments are instituted among men to preserve these rights. God gave that law to Noah to preserve your right. There's a reason why murder is illegal in the United States, and it's not because the government said so. It's not because murder's wrong, and that's just some great moral truth that murder's wrong. Who told anybody that murder was wrong? They didn't tell the animal kingdom. The animal kingdom kills for whatever reason. Hungry, you're in my spot, okay? Animal kingdom will kill anything and everything to get what it wants. Human beings aren't like that. There's tendencies to do that. There's people that kill people all the time. It's a base nature thing, all right? So God had to give a law to protect your right, your human liberty, your civil liberty. God put a law in place to protect that. The founders recognized that that's the reason that law is there. And if there is a law to protect it, it must be really, really, really important to God. And if God put the law there to protect it, if you violate that law or if government violates that law, you're in trouble. The last five are there to preserve man's rights. The two major principles stick out in the last five: life and property. All right, so that's the third principle. Governments are instituted among men to preserve these rights. The whole reason government exists is just to preserve your rights. Whenever God gave that law to Noah originally, the whole reason he did that was just to preserve your right and all the people that it says that the world was covered in violence. Let me see what exactly it. What the God says that the earth was filled with violence and all flesh had corrupted it. Okay, corrupted, theft. What's life, liberty, slavery, pursuit of happiness. Okay, stifling capitalism, stifling your ability to start a business at a whim. Okay, those things were happening, but the most important one was life. That was the first thing that God gave to man, was life. That was your right. God gave that to you. God, nobody but God can take that away, unless, again, getting into the weeds here with civil law and all that. If somebody commits murder, there's purview in the Bible for you to take that in exchange for the life taken. But again, getting into the weeds there. The fourth principle, the law of nature and nature's God. There is a fixed moral law. That's what that means. That's where that came from. Okay. Now that wasn't a new idea back then in 1776. That doesn't mean much to us now. The law of nature and nature's God. Okay, but that did mean a lot to people back then in 1776 because they had heard it countless times from the American pulpits. It was out of a magazine called Blackstone's Commentary, as well as a lot of John Locke's work reference this, the laws of nature and nature's God. And all that essentially means is we want to implore to the world, like France and all those places, there is a law higher than you. Okay, there's something that we can look at in nature. There's something that we believe in, that's God. The laws of nature and nature's God means that there is a fixed moral law that is that's the concrete that the house is built on. You can't choose what you want to put underneath the house. You can't put marshmallows underneath the house. There has to be a fixed moral bedrock to build something on, and for example, a country. So they recognized the law of nature's and nature's God. There has to be a fixed moral law. John Adams said, the Constitution is worthless for a people that's not moral. I'm paraphrasing and butchering that, but essentially the idea is the Constitution you can do whatever you want to with. It's essentially worthless without the Declaration of Independence because there's no mention of rights. Okay, there are in the First Amendment, but as it sits in its original condition with no amendments, it mentions nothing about rights. Therefore, it's essentially worthless without the Declaration of Independence. So you have to have that fixed moral law. No matter what happens, the principles of that fixed moral law, they're resolute. They're forever. Okay? Principles, the idea of a principle is something that is everlasting. The idea that that murder is wrong, or let's go back even further than that. Let's separate and pull back underneath the fabric and see what's really under thou shalt not kill or the right to life. Really pull that back and look at it, and you'll see the principle there is that God gave something to man. Okay, that right that was given cannot be taken away. That's the principle. That principle is the same 4,000 years ago, and it'll be the same 6,000 years in the future. That is a principle. That's the idea of a principle. It's something that can't be changed, something that can't be broken. Fiscal responsibility. Okay, that's always been true. From Babylon to now, if you don't have a savings account, if you're not managing your money properly, you're going to wind up broke and homeless. Okay, that's a principle that does not change. It can't change. It just is. Okay, that's the laws of nature and nature's God. But the idea that there are no moral absolutes and that there's no moral code that's permanent is not a new idea. We see it a lot right now in academia. We see it a lot right now in bigger cities and in the social justice warrior mindset. This idea that there is no, it's your body, your choice. You do what you want. You do you, man. Okay, that is that idea that there's no moral absolutes. You'd be stunned to see the statistics of how many Christians don't believe that there's an absolute moral truth. How can that be possible? How can you call yourself a Christian and not say that there's an absolute law? There's an absolute moral condition that we're held to. Joshua 17, verse 6, there's a great story. I'm not going to go back and read it. And again, I wish I had the screen share. I'll have that next week. Joshua 17, verse 6, I encourage you to go look at that. The reason I'm giving all these Bible verses, first of all, it's important, but to show you that all these things that came in our founding documents, they're everlasting principles. Okay, the Bible was written a long time ago. Whether you believe it or not, the fact of the matter is the Bible was written a long time ago, and the things that are in there have been right for a long time. And we've been using our documents, our founding documents, for a long time, and they've worked. So those principles maintain. They're the same. That's the reason I give you these Bible verses. Go look it up for yourself. These are not new ideas. So why would you try to change it? All right. Again, look at Psalm 111, 7 through 8. David says otherwise, that there is a fixed moral absolute. Okay. I'm approaching 15 minutes here. So I want to take a few questions. I only have about 5 viewers.